There are growing concerns reportedly about absentee ballots. In a new AP analysis, the Associated Press warning, quote, if ballots are rejected at the same rate as during this year's primaries, up to 3 times as many voters in November could be disenfranchised in key battleground states when compared to the last presidential election. President Trump reacted to the report, tweeting, rigged election. However, Joe Biden responded against the president for not doing more to shore up the Postal Service. And he doesn't stop there.
It's long past time to get the post office the $25 billion in emergency funds it needs to keep running. You know, one of the reasons why he doesn't want to do that, he wants to make sure those mail-in ballots don't get where they're supposed to get.
With me now is Matt Whitaker, who served as acting attorney general under President Trump. Matt, thank you for being on the program. So when you read through, I mean, I grew up military. Absentee voting was a way that my parents voted, others did, still do in the military people, without a problem. Why now are they expecting more mistakes and in that particular lane of voting?
Yeah, glad to be with you today, Harris. I think the question is we're going to see an unprecedented number of absentee ballot requests and voting by mail this year. Some of these states appear prepared and have done it, places like Oregon that does have mail-in ballot voting. But there are some states, Pennsylvania and several others, that have not seen this level of mail-in voting. And I think the responsibility is on each voter, if they're going to vote by mail and vote via absentee ballot, is to make sure that they follow each and every step. And I think there's a concern on both sides of the aisle that these mail-in ballots ultimately will be rejected for various reasons. The AP study suggests, improper signatures and other things like mailing it after the election. And so there's a lot of reasons why each and every voter needs to be diligent if they're going to vote absentee to make sure that their vote is counted.
Again, what you're talking about is capacity, and we knew that in March. Like, we knew that when the country was locked down, that we had, this presidential election coming up in November, and that there might be more capacity for people to want to do it one way or the other rather than in person. A USA Today poll finds that nearly 40% of people say they will not or are undecided about accepting the election results if their candidate loses. So what do we do? I mean, there's a lot of talk and reporting, Matt, about it could take a while for us to know exactly what would happen after Election Day. What are you foreseeing?
Well, I expect the tradition of the United States will continue as it has for hundreds of years, that, the results of the election, once they're duly certified by every state and the electors are sent, that they'll be accepted. I worry that if everybody on both sides of the aisle don't do their jobs appropriately, especially the election officials in each and every precinct and county and state, if everyone is above reproach and plays it by the rules that were passed by their legislatures before the election, then I think the result should be clear. I think what people are concerned about is where you get another Florida recount situation where the rules that are being used are changing, and I think that's a real concern. You look at somewhere like if absentee ballots by state law are required to be postmarked to the day of the election, and somehow there's an extension to that deadline, that could change the result, and I think that's where people are worried that the results could be contested. Yeah.
Yeah, I had always thought of, particularly absentee, the certification process being pretty foolproof. And you just answered my other question. Why not extend Election Day? In some countries, the way they have it, like 2 or 3 days, give people who might have to work one day a chance to go in, and then encourage people, if they want to be in person but have to socially distance in line, to have more time. What would it take to see something like that?
Well, Harris, this is the challenge. I mean, obviously, in the era we live in, there are things that could be done or could have been done, but what we can't do is change the game rules at halftime. And I think most people understand that these laws were passed by the people's representatives, and to go in and change them now by executive fiat in each state, again, would bring into doubt the results.
Okay, we'll move to this. President Trump says he's open to investigating Postmaster General Louis DeJoy over allegations of campaign finance violations. The Washington Post reported DeJoy pushed some employees at his former company to donate to GOP campaigns and reimburse them using bonuses. Here's the president.
Let the investigations go, but he's a very respected man. Again, it was a bipartisan commission. Postmaster General is appointed by a bipartisan commission.
If it's proven to be a campaign finance scheme, do you think he should lose his job?
Yeah, if something can be proven that he did something wrong, always.
Matt, take her question. The president said yes, he could lose his job. Take it further. What could happen? Well,
first of all, these are very serious allegations. You can't reimburse somebody for campaign donations that they make. Now, that being said, I'm concerned that DeJoy is just another victim of the politics of personal destruction. He says that all of the way that they did political fundraising at his previous company was reviewed by lawyers and approved by lawyers, and I take his word for it. And what I'm concerned about is this man is perfectly qualified. We've had problems at the Postal Service for as long as I can remember, and he's the type of person with his background and experience in logistics that could actually fix the Postal Service and have it be a successful organization. And so I see the Democrats in Congress playing politics again. As it was said earlier in your show, that he has no impact into whether or not absentee ballots are delivered on time. It's the rank and file postal workers that have to make sure that these ballots are delivered on time. And I think it's just, again, it's just we punish people for raising their hand and being willing to serve. And let's remember, he was chosen by a bipartisan commission, the board that runs the Postal Service, and the president's fingers were not on this. And so to me, this is just another example of a good person Washington trying to destroy another good person.
And if it's found out, as the president said, that he actually did something wrong, he could lose his job. That from the president of the United States, if he really was.
Yeah, there's no doubt if these allegations are true, Harris, that he should lose his job. But I think ultimately this is just more politics of personal destruction.
All right, we'll cover the news. Always great to have you on the program. Matt Whitaker, thank you.
I enjoyed, Harris. Thank you.